You reach for your phone, tap a screen. 30 minutes later, a warm cardboard box arrives at your doorstep. Inside is a perfectly round, cheese-laden pizza. A standard, cheap, comforting staple of modern global life. It's a food so ubiquitous, it's become almost invisible, a lifeless background commodity of our collective late-night laziness. But if we roll the calendar back to the early 19th century and walk the packed, sun-baked alleys of Naples, we find ourselves in a world of pure, unadulterated sensory shock. A visiting American writer and inventor named Samuel Morse, the man who gave us the telegraph, walks through these same streets in 1831. He watches the local population crowding around a street vendor, swallowing pieces of a flat, greasy dough. Morse records his experience in his journal with absolute revulsion, describing the food as bread, like the plate of a baker's oven, spread with a dressing of tomatoes, sprinkled with little fish and black pepper. Of a disgusting appearance, he wrote, like a piece of stale bread that had been dropped in the sewer. He was, by most accounts, an unusually observant traveler. The same man would go on to spend decades perfecting a code for transmitting language across a wire. And yet this particular dish left him only with disgust, no curiosity at all. To the refined eyes of Northern Europeans and wealthy Americans, this flatbread was not a culinary achievement. It was a food of desperation, associated with filth and the absolute lowest dregs of humanity. So how did this despised, sewage-adjacent flatbread, born out of the raw squalor of Europe's most congested slums, cross the Atlantic, conquer the palaces of royalty, and transform into a multi-billion-dollar global empire? This is not just a history of melted cheese and baked dough. It is a saga of mass migration, cultural prejudice, industrial manipulation, and one of the most brilliant culinary rebrandings that ever rewrote the rules of global capitalism. To understand how the pizza was born, we have to look at the suffocating reality of 19th century Naples. Under the stagnant rule of the Bourbon monarchy, Naples was one of the most densely populated cities in all of Europe, more crowded, block for block, than London or Paris, wedged between the spectacular blue of the Mediterranean and the looming shadow of Mount Vesuvius, a volcano. The city's poorest residents lived beneath their entire lives, half forgetting it could still erupt. The city was overflowing with a massive, permanent underclass known as the Lazzaroni. These weren't simply poor people, they were the poorest of the poor, over 50,000 souls with no permanent homes, no stable jobs, and no certainty they'd survive to see the next sunrise. They slept on cold stone steps, huddled in dark volcanic caves, or packed themselves into tiny windowless rooms called bassi, often sharing a single space with an entire extended family and whatever animals they could keep alive. To survive, the Lazzaroni needed a food that was dirt cheap, packed with energy, and could be eaten on the run, with one hand free for whatever odd job the day might offer. The local bakers answered the call. They took a simple wheat dough, rolled it flat, and baked it as cheaply as possible in wood-fired ovens carved into volcanic stone. A material that held heat with remarkable efficiency, thanks to the very mountain looming over the city to keep the cost next to nothing. They topped it with whatever the wealthy discarded. Lard, the cheapest animal fat available, coarse rock salt, raw garlic, dried oregano. If they had a few pennies more, tiny salted bait fish, too small and bony for the real fish markets, sold off cheap by fishermen who couldn't be bothered to clean them properly. When Spanish ships brought tomatoes from the Americas, Europeans initially feared them as poisonous, tools of the devil that would rot the blood, some botanists claimed, simply because the plant belonged to the same nightshade family as deadly belladonna. Wealthy households sometimes grew tomatoes purely as ornamental curiosities, admiring the fruit while refusing to let anyone eat it. a full century before anyone in polite society would consider it food. But the starving Lazzaroni looked at the cheap, abundant red fruit and saw only survival. They crushed the tomatoes straight onto their flat dough, inventing the basic tomato sauce out of sheer necessity, with no fear left to spare for a rumor about poison. This wasn't a food eaten at tables with knives and forks. It was sold by weight, cut into rough strips, folded in half like a greasy book, devoured by workers whose hands were covered in the soot and coal of the harbor docks. To make matters more desperate, the pizza economy ran on a system of pure poverty. Pizzerias operated a credit system called pizza at Otto. A starving worker could eat a hot pizza on a freezing winter morning and have exactly 8 days to pay the baker back, a weekly cycle of debt that kept the city's poorest alive and kept the bakers themselves teetering on the edge of ruin whenever a client simply vanished into the crowded alleys, owing 8 days' worth of dough that would never be repaid. The upper classes of Naples looked at this food with absolute horror. The smell of garlic and lard and baking dough, tangled up in their minds with the filth of the open sewers running down the center of the alleys. The French author Alexandre Dumas wrote extensively about it, warning readers this food was the definitive mark of Neapolitan poverty, a gastronomic barometer, he called it, one that rose and fell with the price of lard and tomatoes, cheaper toppings appearing whenever the harvest failed or the docks went quiet. Dumas himself, ever the tourist, still tried it and admitted a grudging fascination, even as he warned his French readers away from the stuff. When cholera swept through Naples in 1837 and again in 1884, the wealthy elite and foreign doctors immediately blamed the pizza, the greasy dough, the rotting tomatoes, a toxic vector of the epidemic, they claimed, despite having no real evidence connecting the two, beyond the fact that both were common in the same crowded streets. The city authorities even proposed banning it outright, hoping to scrub the streets of its garlic-heavy scent and hide the embarrassing reality of their poverty from wealthy tourists arriving by steamship to admire the ruins of Pompeii. The turning point came in 1889, and it was driven not by culinary appreciation, but by cold, calculated political propaganda. For decades, Italy had been a fractured collection of rival kingdoms and duchies, speaking different dialects, harboring centuries of mutual resentment. The unification movement had theoretically bound these regions under a single flag in 1861, but the reality was a deeply divided country. The impoverished South resented the wealthy northern rulers who now sat in the new capital of Rome, taxing a population that felt increasingly like a conquered people, rather than fellow citizens who had simply gained a new flag. Some Southern intellectuals of the time openly wrote of the unification as a second conquest, no gentler than the first, just carried out with parliaments instead of armies. To heal these wounds, King Umberto I and his wife, Queen Margherita of Savoy, embarked on a royal tour of the country. In the summer of 1889, they arrived in Naples. While the king attended military reviews, Queen Margherita found herself exhausted by the endless parade of French haute cuisine, the mandatory food of every royal court in Europe, regardless of which country that court happened to sit in. She wanted to taste something authentic. Her advisors realized this could be a spectacular public relations move, a small gesture that might do more for the crown's popularity in the South than any military parade. The royal palace summoned the most famous pizzaiolo in Naples, a man named Raffaele Esposito, who ran the Pizzeria Brandi with his wife, Maria Giovanna. Esposito, knowing his entire career hung in the balance, set up his ingredients in the royal kitchens. He prepared 3 styles of pizza for the sovereign: a traditional white pizza with pork lard and basil, a classic marinara heavy with garlic and oregano, and a third, a new patriotic creation, bright red tomato sauce. pure white mozzarella made from water buffalo milk, a handful of vibrant green basil leaves, a calculated visual representation of the new Italian flag. When the pizza was presented to the Queen, she took a single bite and was reportedly enchanted. She instructed her royal chamberlain to write an official letter of gratitude to Esposito. The letter, stamped with the royal seal and dated June the 11th, 1889, declared the pizzas most delicious. This decision to seek royal approval for a food born in the slums seemed small at the time. It was not. Esposito, with a brilliant instinct for marketing, immediately named the patriotic pizza after the Queen herself, the Margherita. He hung the royal letter on the wall of his pizzeria, transforming a food of the starving Lazzaroni into a patriotic symbol of unified Italian identity. Yet step inside the ballroom endorsement, the pizza remained a local curiosity, confined to Naples, still viewed by the rest of Italy with suspicion. It would take decades before most of the country outside Campania had ever tasted the dish that supposedly represented the nation's flag. To truly conquer the globe, it would have to leave the Mediterranean behind entirely, riding on the backs of millions of desperate people fleeing a homeland that could no longer feed them. The true engine of pizza's global conquest wasn't a royal decree, it was the collapse of the southern Italian economy. High tariffs, heavy land taxes, a series of brutal agricultural depressions that plunged the southern provinces into hopeless poverty, driving small farmers off land their families had worked for generations. Between 1880 and 1920, over 4 million Italians packed their belongings into wooden crates and crossed the Atlantic. Most were peasants from Campania, Calabria and Sicily, arriving in the crowded ports of New York, Boston and Philadelphia with nothing but their strength and their culinary traditions. They packed into the tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side, a neighborhood that became known as Little Italy, where entire buildings might house immigrants from a single Neapolitan village, recreating the social fabric of home one tenement floor at a time, sometimes down to the specific street they'd left behind. Because New York's cold, damp climate made it impossible to grow their traditional vegetables, the immigrants rebuilt their kitchens with American ingredients. Local bakers built massive brick ovens in dark basements beneath the tenements. But unlike the wood-fired ovens of Naples, these ran on coal, cheap and plentiful, in an industrial American city. Coal burned hotter and drier, creating a charred, crispy crust entirely different from the soft, soupy pizzas back home. A difference some Neapolitan purists would spend the next century complaining about. One of these immigrants was a man named Gennaro Lombardi, trained as a baker in Naples, who had crossed the Atlantic as a teenager with little more than the recipes he'd memorized in his father's kitchen. In 1897, Lombardi opened a small grocery store on Spring Street, catering to the growing Italian workforce. In 1905, he received the very first official business license to operate a pizzeria in the United States, cementing Lombardi's as the birthplace of American pizza. Several of the men who trained under him, including Anthony Pero and Antonio Tano Pero, went on to open their own pizzerias across the city, spreading a single lineage of dough and technique across an entire borough within a generation. These early pizzerias had no tables, no menus, no waiters. Workers walked in, stated how many cents they had, and received a corresponding slice cut from a massive tray. A worker with 3 cents got a substantial piece of dough topped with tomato paste, wrapped in scrap paper, a vital source of energy for the men building the subways and raising the skyscrapers of New York. And yet, outside these immigrant neighborhoods, the broader American public looked at pizza with the same prejudice they directed at Italian immigrants themselves. A bizarre, exotic bread, best avoided, its garlic smell treated as evidence of some deeper foreignness. One more reason for the mainstream press to describe Little Italy as a dangerous, unsanitary slum, For nearly 4 decades, pizza remained locked inside the immigrant community, a secret food of survival the rest of America chose to ignore. World War II shattered that quarantine forever. In 1943, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Campania and Sicily. As young soldiers fought their way north, tired of tasteless rations and canned meat, they tasted the real pizza of Naples, and they were instantly hooked. When the war ended in 1945, millions of soldiers came home with an insatiable craving for the hot, cheesy pies they'd discovered overseas. A taste memory tangled up with their memories of survival and the relief of the war finally ending. A massive post-war pizza boom swept across America, perfectly timed with suburbanization, the baby boom, and a new fast-paced consumer culture. To meet the demand, pizza had to shed its slow artisan roots and embrace industrial efficiency. In the late 1930s, an inventor named Frank Mastro developed a commercial gas-fired oven that ran on a simple thermostat, letting any untrained teenager bake a consistent pizza at the turn of a dial, no longer dependent on a skilled pizzaiolo who'd spent years learning to read the coals by eye. In 1943 in Chicago, an entrepreneur named Ike Sewell challenged the thin crust of New York with a massive deep-dish pizza at Pizzeria Uno, baked in a cake pan, layered almost in reverse with cheese beneath the sauce to keep it from burning during the long bake time. But the true industrialization came through franchising. In 1958, 2 brothers from Wichita, Kansas, Dan and Frank Carney, borrowed $500 from their mother to open a small pizzeria. They called it Pizza Hut, simply because their sign only had space for 8 letters. Within decades, they'd built a global corporate juggernaut, standardizing every recipe so a pizza ordered in Tokyo tasted identical to one in Munich, right down to the exact temperature of the oven and the precise weight of cheese on every pie. In 1960, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a young man named Tom Monahan bought a small, failing pizza shop. He realized the key to success wasn't the taste of the food, it was the speed of delivery. He renamed the company Domino's and pioneered the 30-minute delivery guarantee, developing specialized insulated boxes designed to keep a pizza hot across an entire city in the time it took most people to boil water for pasta. Meanwhile, the frozen food revolution was taking over kitchens everywhere. In the 1950s, companies like Celentano Brothers and Rose Totino began mass-producing frozen, par-baked pizzas that could sit in a freezer for months, feeding a generation of families who had never once set foot in an Italian restaurant. To survive that industrial freezing process, corporate food scientists permanently altered the chemistry of the food itself, engineering processed tomato sauces, synthetic cheese analogues that melted without releasing water, and chemically treated doughs loaded with preservatives, each ingredient re-engineered to survive a supply chain the original Neapolitan bakers could never have imagined. A chain that now stretched across oceans and freezers and decades. Pizza had achieved total global conquest, but in doing so, it had been stripped of its soul. A lifeless, factory-produced disk of convenience, manufactured on conveyor belts and shipped in refrigerated containers across the globe. It's one of the most profound paradoxes in modern culinary history. The pizza, born as a desperate cry for survival in the slums of Naples, conquered the world only by destroying its own identity. The food that was once a symbol of raw, authentic poverty is now a highly engineered, standardized unit of corporate profit, eaten under neon lights or delivered through the rain by squeaking scooters. We didn't make pizza better as we spread it across the globe. We simply made it fast, predictable, cheap. The original Neapolitan pizza was a living thing, reflecting the daily price of lard, the quality of the harvest, the skill of the hands that stretched the dough under the Mediterranean sun. The modern industrial pizza is a monument to convenience, a food designed to be eaten without thinking, sold by a chain rather than a family, standardized so completely that the person behind the counter rarely bakes it at all, and often has never seen the inside of Naples in their life, let alone stood in one of its narrow, garlic-scented alleys where all of this began. So the next time you open a warm cardboard box or bite into a slice of melted cheese, look closely at that charred crust. You're not just looking at a quick dinner, you're looking at the ghosts of the laceroni who ate this dough to survive the cholera years, the political calculations of a 19th century queen trying to save her crown, the desperate hopes of millions of southern Italian immigrants who packed their lives into the cargo holds of Atlantic steamships, and the cold efficiency of the corporate food barons who turned a survival tool into a global commodity. Because behind every bite, there's an empire that rose, a class that fell, an ocean that was crossed twice over, and a history most people never hear. If this journey from the slums of Naples to the suburbs of the world surprised you, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let us know in the comments below what shocked you more. That pizza was once blamed for spreading cholera, or that the margherita was actually a calculated royal propaganda stunt. We're back in just 2 days with another hidden history behind the food on your plate, digging into the dark, medicinal origins of the world's most controversial spirit. I'm Edible Empires, and this is the history behind every bite.